Roger that, Victor. See you on the other side.
The stage is yours.
Excellent. Thank you. Dzień dobry. So I'm going to start with a story because, as Andrew says, I'm traveling all over the place at the moment. And 2 weeks ago, I was in New York. And some of you may know the story of New York. That actually, in 1890, they said that New York would not exist in 1980. So in 1890, there was lots of predictions made about New York and said, actually, as a city, it won't exist in the year 1980. It was going to be uninhabitable. And the reason for that was because they realized in 1890 that the population was doubling in New York every 20 years. And they calculated if the population continued to grow at that rate, they would need 6 million horses for the population of New York by 1980. Now, I don't know how much you know about horses, but the average horse excrements 15 to 35 pounds of horse dung. So 6 million horses would have meant that every single street in New York would have been 9 foot under with horse poo, and obviously uninhabitable. And I mentioned that story because we were at a summit called Beyond the Bubble. And there's many bubbles that exist in our industry around things like Gen.AI. But we need to be careful because when we consider these bubbles, we consider them based on our understanding of what happens today, that we have horses. And so actually our prediction is based on having 6 million horses in 1980 and New York being uninhabitable. But the reality turns out very different. And I mention that because we're in a bit of a bubble at the moment with this term and this hype around Gen.AI, which is fantastic. But I've been in this industry long enough. I wasn't at the first Aspire, Andrew, but I was, I think, at the third one. I've been in this industry long enough to remember that 18 years ago, we all talked about blockchain. And that in 15 years' time, we wouldn't need SAP, we wouldn't need Oracle, because all of our finance systems would be in the blockchain. Now, blockchain's great, there's some nice use cases, but the finance practitioners are still here, and SAP and Oracle are still here, and it hasn't quite changed the world in the way that was predicted. Then 10 years ago, I remember a conversation with a Blue Prism salesperson about RPA. And he said to me, Rakesh, this is the future of the world. 80% of support services roles will be automated through RPA. And everyone was very excited 10 years ago and bought way too many licenses and spent way too much money that they're now regretting on RPA. And in reality, again, great technology has a place, but didn't quite change the world in the way that was perceived. And today we have Gen.AI. And we see a similar hype and a similar bubble around Gen.AI. And I think if you want to avoid, the horse dung expression, our view is just be careful around how you use technology the right place, in the right area to achieve the outcome you want. Because the reality is there is no silver bullet. There's not going to be one technology that fixes all of your problems in your processes. Actually, that's done through hard work, understanding your processes, structuring your data, putting good knowledge management in place. And that's where the focus should really be. Gen.AI has a place, blockchain has a place, RPA has a place. But in reality, you have to probably use all of those together to generate your outcomes. So what we're going to give you today is a real view of what's happening in the market around GBS, shared services, and outsourcing. and we'll share with you 9 of the biggest trends that you should be considering that's really changing the marketplace. The first one is around insourcing. Now, insourcing is growing faster than ever before. What I mean by insourcing is when someone has outsourced to a third party, like an Accenture or a Genpact or an Infosys, and they bring the services back in. So at the moment, in the last 18 months, there's been a huge spate of insourcing. So you'd have seen in Poland, TE Connectivity insourced, I think, from Capgemini, Nikon insourced from WNS, Dyson is insourced from Accenture, Heineken insourced earlier from Genpact. There's a number of organizations who have made this decision. Actually, we don't want to do outsourcing anymore. We want to bring it back in-house. Smith & Nephew insourced from HP. There's lots of examples. And it happens to all of the BPO providers currently. And the reason for this, there's probably 4 key reasons why this happens. Number one is the CXO changes. So the CFO doesn't like outsourcing anymore. It happens. Number 2 is the performance isn't right. So they thought, okay, they were very good maybe R2R, but they weren't very good at accounts payable. And actually, so they had to reshape the contract, take some of that back in-house to really get it working. Number 3 can be the feeling of agility. So especially after COVID, there were lots of organizations that had outsourced, but wanted to do things in a different way, and didn't have the agility that they were looking for, because they wanted to change their contract terms, and they'd have to go through so much governance and bureaucracy that it made it very difficult. And the other part of that is having sometimes the scope close to headquarters allows you to move more into your GBS model. So there's a lot of reasons why this has happened, but there's certain, well, the 4th reason is then AI and automation, because sometimes when you outsource, there's an expectation that the outsourcer is going to automate lots of your processes, and sadly, the reality is not always the same. So that organizations think that they can bring it back in-house, they can automate it themselves, and they can achieve better outcomes. It's interesting, we work with AstraZeneca in the UK, and they've outsourced to Genpact. And actually, AstraZeneca built up their own automation team because they were so frustrated with Genpact, which has grown faster and achieved more outcomes than their Genpact relationship. So there's a few reasons why this happens, but that's definitely one of the trends that you should be aware of. And actually, the most popular model linked to that trend is the hybrid model, where an organization has its own captive shared services capability, but then outsources tactically, little bits of scope, for reasons of, when something is repetitive, more standardized, and for some reason they decide not to automate it, they can also outsource that. So the hybrid model is growing to be the most popular model. Trend number 2, this is sometimes a controversial one for IT leaders, but GBS and shared services is increasingly becoming the home for automation, AI, data mining, and analytics within organizations. Because the GBS and shared services capability includes a lot of the scope and the processes where all of these activities are performed. And to get these initiatives working well, you have to have that deep knowledge. And that deep knowledge really sits in the GBS environment. So I would always encourage each of you. I find that there's a lot of activity around automation. There's probably not as much thinking around data mining and analytics. And I have to say, for those of us in Poland or in Central Eastern Europe, this is a must. Because at some stage, as a GBS, if you're not providing value back to the business in these new dynamic areas, people are going to question your existence and just look for a lower cost location. So, for those GBS leaders in the room today, it has to be a must in your vision, your strategy for the future, How are you going to embrace automation, AI, data analytics, data mining? The third thing, which still remains core, is when you're setting up. Yeah? So if you're a young center, if you're not very mature, that focus has to still be on cost, on standardization, and on process efficiency. And this is still important, 25 years down the line, because generally in this industry, you go through a bit of an evolution. So you start off with a business case of moving roles from expensive places like Switzerland and the US, and there's a clear wage arbitrage business case for migrating into a lower cost location. But then the organization forgets about that very quickly. So 2 years later, they're saying, okay, great, we've got those initial benefits. What are you going to do now? It's similar to my wife. I brought her a lovely engagement ring when we got married, very expensive, but she forgot very quickly. After we got married, she's like, what have you done for me lately, Rakesh? So the same exists in our environment, and you have to be driving cost standardization and process efficiency in those years post getting the wage arbitrage. So kind of years 3 to 6 of your maturity of a GBS shared service center, these become real priorities. And it's difficult to achieve because it means that you have to look at stakeholders in the Nordics, in the UK, in Germany, in France, and you have to change their behaviors and really help to standardize those processes. But that's definitely a trend for the early centers to really drive that thinking and that capability. For the more mature ones, so as you get to maybe 10 years of existence as a GBS, you've delivered on the wage arbitrage, you've delivered on the standardization and some of the performance improvement and efficiencies, then the question is, what else? And what we're seeing in this marketplace is that the more mature GBS centers are wholly focused then on the user experience and customer satisfaction. And you maybe have heard of the watermelon effect, that your metrics seem green from the top, but they're red and gangrene in reality because you feel a certain way. And you hear that from many businesses, especially when you're using systems and tools that are convoluted, difficult to use, not very user-friendly. And then you go back to your personal life, and you're using Amazon, which is really easy to use, and other tools that are very consumer-friendly. So the focus really of the mature GBS and shared services is all about user satisfaction, customer satisfaction, and that experience layer. And companies like Ecolab have created like GBS 4.0, which is all about that user experience. So that's certainly a trend that we see. Number 5, the current environment, the current economic environment is a challenging one. So IMF recently released the growth of the Eurozone statistics. I think it was this week. And it predicts that the Eurozone is going to grow a GDP growth of about 1.8% over the next 3 years. Which, some people are really positive about, but I'm an economist from the LSE by background. It's a terrible level of growth. So there's a lot more macro pressure to look at other mechanisms to drive profitability in businesses. For GBS and shared services, that's a good thing. So what we're seeing more and more is that organizations are going from just kind of the core transactional services, really moving up that value chain, because I think one of the things that COVID taught us was that if you can have someone in London doing a role that's quite complicated, and then they can work from home and they move to Newcastle, then actually you can have them in Newcastle. And if you can have them in Newcastle, you can probably have them in Scotland, which is cheaper. And if you can have them in Scotland, you can probably have them in Poland. But if you can have them in Poland, you can probably move them also to India. So I think the reality is organizations are now really embracing these concepts no longer as just, oh, it's a transactional role for a low-cost location, but more as talent hubs, where we can move real talent and capability into a particular center. You know, UBS and Credit Suisse, for example, in Wrocław, they hire lawyers from Wrocław because they recognize that the top talent in the UK and in Zurich, they won't go to them. They'll go to one of the big law firms, the Linklaters and the Magic Circle law firms. But actually in Wrocław, they can attract that talent. So more and more, we're seeing locations not just as transactional processing capabilities, more as talent hubs for a wide range of services. And as part of that, what used to be very much finance, HR, IT, procurement, what we're now starting to see is more and more marketing. So obviously Amway have a big center in Krakow where they do a little bit of marketing. We see more and more supply chain. We see more legal processes being moved because actually when you use a lawyer, you use a lawyer for some tasks that are expensive and some tasks that are cheap. If you can decompose that and say, okay, the transactional activity maybe we can use in the center and actually get the lawyers to do the real general counsel work, then that can be beneficial. Logistic operations and even new things like ESG reporting. So more and more, ESG and sustainability is becoming high on the agenda for organizations, and they're looking for who owns this in our business. And some of those leaders are saying, well, why don't we just give it to the GBS because they understand processes and data, and they can help us with our reporting requirements. So that's increasingly coming into scope. And then more specific industry-related things, like in insurance, there's claims processing. But what we're seeing overall is an increase in the scope and an increase in the types of services within GBS. Number 6, and I could talk about this for hours, this comes back to the point that we were talking about earlier, which is that whole technology toolkit. And how do you leverage technology together to generate the outcome that you're looking for? So you see on the far left-hand side is your core systems, your ERPs. And this is a big question because, let me ask a question. How many of you have moved to S/4HANA? I see hands in the air. Okay, about 30% of the room. How many of you, those 30%, have you spent less than 30 million on S/4HANA? No hands go in the air. Interesting, huh? So what we're seeing is, S/4HANA, we have a client that spent 985 million on their S/4HANA implementation. So more and more businesses are realizing actually maybe having a customized ERP is not going to generate a huge business case for our business. So when they're looking at their technology in their landscape, they're really thinking, maybe I should have a vanilla ERP on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we should customize on other technology. We should use maybe reconciliation tools, matching tools, learning and development tools that give us the specific customization that we're looking for, which is going to cost us a lot less than customizing on the ERP and give us a better user experience. And you saw some of that demand when we were talking about RPA, because organizations wanted to do more customized activities there. But the problem with using all of these different technologies is then how do you bring them together? And that's known as orchestration. So what we're seeing now in the marketplace is that orchestration layer in the middle being the most important part of bringing all of your technology together. And tools like ServiceNow and service management tools being used for that. Now, ServiceNow is interesting because ServiceNow used to be used as a ticketing tool. So businesses would just say, hey, I have it in my IT help desk or HR or finance, and it just does tickets. And the way it's changing If you look at companies like Aptiv and Swarovski, they're now looking at it as a service management platform to orchestrate all of their processes. What does that mean? It means every single process goes through that service management platform. It automates all of the KPIs and the reporting, and it triggers all of your automation. So it means on the right-hand side, you can have BPM, you can have some Gen.AI, you can have some process mining, you can have conversational AI, and all of these technologies are very useful, and there's use cases for each of them, but you can use ServiceNow or something similar to trigger all of those. And that's the direction of travel that leading businesses are really looking at. Stop thinking about just ticketing tools and start thinking about automating your whole end-to-end process through service management platforms. And on the right-hand side, that can give you a lot of tactical automation. Yeah, I think there's lots of good examples, for example, of Gen.AI in GBS and shared services. The number one use case for Gen.AI, I'll give you number one and number two. The number one use case for Gen.AI in GBS and shared services is using and reading your SOPs, your standard operating procedures. So what you can do is if you have good standard operating procedures, when you have a new joiner, he can ask a question to a conversational AI agent and say, how do I process accounts payable in Italy? And it will read every single SOP and it will provide a view of how that user should be processing that invoice in Italy. And it references the SOP that it took that information from. And we've done that 5 times for 5 different GBSs. So it's like a really popular use case. That's one. The other really popular use case is around credit management. So I know Rockwell Automation do this because the problem today is that we want data quickly. So in credit management, when you're using the agencies, they only give you that data maybe once a year, but you want that data updated once a month or even once a week because businesses change very quickly. So what you can do is you can use the agency data, you can mix it with your own experience of how they pay and with the timeliness of their payments. You can take information from Google and the news, pull it all together to create your own credit score. And that's an example of something that Rockwell have done. So, there are good examples on the right-hand side, which you should definitely be looking at. A couple of others, intelligent data extraction. If you're not using any type of intelligent data extraction for your invoice processing, then you should be, because you should be achieving about 70-80% just from using AI and computer vision to read invoices. This is a very easy area to automate. And the other easy area in finance is probably cash application. If you're doing cash apps manually, there's definitely a business case to get to about 85% auto match. So, the technology is really making a difference, but you have to use it in the right places, and you have to use the right tool in the right places, and that's really the trend. And think about how you orchestrate that together. Number 7, the angel of death. So it's true to say, there's been some analysis reports that Gen.AI will mean that GBS is dying. There's been other analysis that RPA is also dead because UiPath's share price has rocketed downwards over the last year or so. So the reality is neither GBS nor RPA are dying. Sadly, for some of you that hate it, but it's still here. It's just that these mechanisms will need to evolve. GBS needs to evolve given the marketplace around AI and automation and data analytics that is here today. RPA still has a place. It's just not going to automate 80% of your processes. It's more like 5 or 10%. But it should be part of that ecosystem. So don't think that they're dead. just realize that they're maybe not the panacea that they were set out to be at the start. And BPO is not dead either. So, whilst we say there's a lot of insourcing that's happening at the moment, the BPO industry is still growing. And there's still organizations outsourcing parts of their activity, maybe not the same way they used to. So when I started my career, I used to work for Deloitte and then Accenture. There was lots of outsourcing deals, 1,000 people outsourcing deals. Whereas today, the average is maybe 50 people or 100 people. So the industry is still here, but it's a lot smaller than it used to be in terms of deal size. Number 8, and this is not a popular one, but the trend is, globally, that there are more people in offices today than there were last year. And it's likely that there'll be more people in physical offices next year than there was this year. Because the direction of travel of companies is moving more back into offices and slightly reducing that remoteness and that remote working. And that doesn't mean that they're going to go from 1 day a week to 5 days a week. It may mean that an organization goes from 1 day a week to 2 days a week, or 2 days a week to 3 days a week. So, but the direction of travel is definitely more people in offices than there was before. It's not a popular one because I know many people don't like it, but if you look at the data, employees show some initial discontent, but don't necessarily leave. So the data doesn't prove that attrition increases if you change your strategy. It does prove that employee satisfaction decreases for a period of time, but the attrition doesn't necessarily increase as well. That's quite an interesting one. Peter, I feel like you want to say something about that. You sure? Do you agree, Peter? Okay. That's the important thing. And finally, number 9, I think the realization that the greatest asset in GBS and shared services is people. And if you don't train your people, if you don't increase the competence of your workforce, then actually you're going to fail. I think having a clear vision, looking at enriching your workforce lives by giving them new experiences, going to conferences, understanding what automation looks like, what AI looks like, how to really carry out your day-to-day tasks is imperative today, not just for retention and attraction, but I think also in terms of building more value from your greatest asset, that is people. So what we are seeing more and more is within this GBS and shared services industry, more training, more focus on building up the skills in softer skills, but also in hard skills and also in transformation. Understanding how to capture a process, how to identify an automation opportunity. These are really key training ideas. We personally, we've partnered with CIMA around building and launching a certification just around GBS, and I think that's quite exciting. And we recognize and we see the trend across organizations today that you have to get your workforce better today than it has been before, and you have to invest in that. Take them to different centers, bring them into conferences, get them to meet automation providers, because there's lots of opportunities to enrich their lives rather than just carrying on that day-to-day job, because you're going to lose them if you don't do that. And those were the key things for me. In terms of my takeaways for you, I think the 3 key things I would say to remember is, number 1, don't be caught up with the bubble. So be aware that Gen.AI is fantastic, embrace it, but it's not going to be able to automate all of your processes. The hard work starts with understanding your processes, cleansing your data, getting your knowledge management working the right way. And if you put those fundamentals in place, then AI and Gen.AI will be a lot easier. Number two, it's around get your operating model right. Have a clear vision and strategy around what you want to do in each location, how you want to use technology, how you want to use outsourcers, because that strategy is going to make you successful for the future. And my third and final takeaway is people. People, people, people. Train your people, build the competence. The greatest barrier to AI today is not the AI technology itself, but it's the people and the mindsets of people. So you want to create an organization that embraces this technology and doesn't fear it. Thank you. You've been a great audience. I'm Rakesh Sangani.
Thanks, Rakesh. I like it when you use the word panacea.
Did you like that
I hear that a lot these days,
Do you?
Yeah, I do.
Not for me. It's the first
it's quite
time
a new
I've
word,
used
though,
it.
isn't it?
It's the first time I've said it with you, Andrew.
Is it? See, panacea is one of these words that's coming out of America these days. It's a trending word. You picked that up in New York, didn't you?
Maybe.
Was it with the horse fertilizer and...
I used to say nirvana, but I've evolved it to panacea now.
Okay. I mean, you were talking about location, though, and you were talking about Wrocław and UBS and Credit Suisse and how they're taking on local ideas and what have you. I mean, you spoke about Newcastle, Scotland, India. And Amazon last week said that we have to go back to the office 5 days a week from January. You didn't mention that here.
Yep.
Should we mention that here?
I kind of mentioned it. I said there's more people back into the offices. So I think the best example for me, Amazon, you're right, made that announcement last week. But the best example is Zoom. Zoom's business is all about remote working. Their whole business model is dependent on remote working, yet they have everyone in the office 5 days a week. They realize that. So I think, you could quote the Amazon one, but I prefer the Zoom example because that's actually the most powerful one. This is definitely like it or not, this is definitely the direction of travel.
It is.
And there's a lot of reasons why, I think it helps. It helps especially with the younger workforce in terms of training, coaching, upskilling. There's some organizations that refuse to do it, I have to say, so there are exceptions, but they're not the norm.
And I think that the final one I wanted to pick up on here as well is you mentioned UiPath. Obviously, it's a Central Eastern European success story. We haven't had that many from Central Eastern Europe, have we? And I know they're a Romanian company. We've got a few people from Romania in the audience today as well, actually. You must be very proud of UiPath. But should they not learn from Meta and others and just sack half their workforce to see their share price go up? Isn't that just how simple it is today, Rakesh?
They did sack half their workforce.
And it still didn't help.
And it still didn't help. So Daniel Dinez is now back. I don't know if you caught the news. So the CEO left and was replaced by the founder, Daniel Dinez, recently. So look, I think with all of these forms of technology, you have to be careful around when you engage with a provider. I'll give you an example. Is anyone from High Radius in the room today? Good. I'll talk about High Radius. So they are like where UiPath were before they IPO'd. So they're the market leader in order-to-cash platforms. They were really good 4 or 5 years ago, really customer-orientated, very customer-focused. But now they want to IPO. So what does that mean? It means that they've just hired, they spent all of their money on sales guys and marketing folk. So all of you have probably got a call from High Radius at some stage. And it means they're not investing as much in the customer, the help desk. And it changes the way that organization interacts. And our prediction is actually, whilst it's the market leader in order to cash today, it will go down over the next couple of years because of that. And it's the same thing that happened to UiPath. It's the same thing that happened to Blue Prism. It will probably happen to Celonis as well. There is a period of time where this technology, they're hungry, they're very flexible, they're working with you, they're cheaper, and they're easier to work with. So you do have to consider that, I think.
And I think the final thing, just, I don't know whether you guys know, I go to America quite a lot as well, and as you heard from Rakesh, he's over there quite a lot too. Now, on the insourcing topic, I've been to places like Austin, Texas recently, Nashville, Tennessee, and I see shared service centers there from Amazon, from UBS, from Apple. I mean, is that how you gauge insourcing as well? Are they taking those shared services back to America, some of these companies?
Some companies are. Yeah, and there's a real interesting business model around that. Yeah, because it sounds crazy. Why would you have a shared service center in Tennessee? And sometimes it is crazy, and sometimes it's not. So it's crazy when they're just doing transactional activity, the scope is limited, they're not providing strategic value, and at some point in time, those will move. But it's not crazy when they're investing in the right technology and the data analytics, when they're close to the headquarters, so they can expand the scope, and they can build more of a center of expertise rather than just a transactional service hub. So I think it's not as crazy as it sounds.
Is there a tax efficiency maybe that's happened there too?
There's some tax efficiency, but when you compare that to a 40-50% wage arbitrage benefit, it doesn't outweigh that, unfortunately.
But they're not outsourcing to California, are they?
No, exactly, exactly.
Does anybody have any questions as we come to the end of this talk? I know that Rakesh has brought up a lot of topics, so maybe someone has some questions. Shemek, please.
Rakesh, I have one question. Looking at the global trends and at the Polish business services industry, from your perspective, what's the most irritating point?
Ooh, first of all, a round of applause for Shemek, who's just come back from military duty to join us today. And, I heard about his story last night, and what he's gone through, I think, really brings everything to life, really. So thank you, Shemek, for the question. So what irritates me about Poland in a global context, for me, it's the complacency. Yeah, I think, and I mentioned it in the presentation today. Look, I think the reality is, if you've achieved that initial wage arbitrage, and then you do nothing else for years upon years upon years, then someone's going to make a decision for you. So I think the opportunity is actually to say, to control your own destiny. So sometimes what I hear is, but Rakesh, I can't do this because no one's allowed me to. Okay. And I think what you need to do is to control your own destiny, is to realize that actually wage arbitrage is not enough. And this is only it's not all centers, I have to say. So there's a certain amount of centers that are not necessarily driving that level of value. And the problem is you become like the blockbuster video of the GBS and shared services world. You'll just become non-existent. Who remembers blockbuster video? There we go. Not a lot of you. That makes me feel really old. Look up blockbuster video and why they don't exist anymore. There we go. So Peter remembers them. So yeah, look, you don't want to be here in 10 years' time and no one remember who you are.
Okay.
And I think that's the challenge.
Thanks, Rakesh, because it's very similar to my perspective is that the most irritating is the passive behavior of leaders. It's really something that it's making crazy.
Exactly. I think there's a real opportunity, and not just waiting for something to happen, being proactive to make it happen. I think that's the key thing. Challenging your CFO, your COO, your HRD to say, actually, this is what we should be doing. This is how GBS or shared services drives a competitive advantage for the business, not just reduces a bit of cost. Thank you, Shemek.
Any more questions? Thomas, come.
Hey, Rakesh.
Hey, Tomasz.
So you were talking a lot about Gen.AI, and my question is more around how did that changed your life as a consultant in terms of how are you give us a case study where you are using it to make a pitch or whatever.
Yeah, I think the one that comes to mind immediately, Thomas, when you ask that question, is task mining. Yeah, so when I started my career as a consultant, I used to work for Deloitte as a consultant, and we used to do these activities where we used to time how long every step takes of a process. So you would sit down next to someone and you say, okay, that step, that took you 2 minutes. And they would hate it because, you're this annoying person with a stop clock next to them timing each activity. And then what you do is you'd add them all up to get a really clear view of how long does it take to perform this role. And then you try and extrapolate that to say, okay, if there's 100,000 transactions, ultimately it should take this long, and we can cut out these steps. And it takes a long time to do that because you need to get a decent sample to stop clock everyone to be able to do that exercise. Now, we use task mining now to do that. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with task mining technology, but what it does, and again, people don't always like it, but what it does, you put it on every agent's laptop or desktop, and it records what they do over a period of time. So let's say you've got a team of 10 people that are doing a similar activity. They're doing HR admin, let's say. So you put it into the team of 10 people, and then the AI reads everything that they've done over a period of, let's say, 3 weeks, and it aggregates it into an AI platform, and it says, actually, this is what you should be standardizing, this is what you should be automating, and this is where you've got a productivity issue, and you maybe need to retrain. And that's a great example of replacing the work we used to do as consultants with task mining. I guess the other one is maybe process mining, because some organizations will use process mining instead of doing process mapping and say, actually, we can leverage the technology that gives us a clear view of how our process works instead of sitting with people to do that activity. So those are two examples where technology and Gen.AI is really changing this landscape. Thank you. Patricia. You said you were going to ask me a difficult question.
Yeah, hi. So you mentioned that the critical key success factor is customer experience. So how do we measure the trust from our customers, and how do we measure the experience, taking under consideration that we are very long on the market? How we can increase it still?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's a difficult one to answer because people are complicated. And obviously Net Promoter Score is used often to measure customer satisfaction and that user experience. So I would certainly have that. But the problem with Net Promoter Score is it depends on a point of time. You had one bad experience over the year, but they caught you just when you had that bad experience. So, that can sometimes be a problem. I think the most important factor is engagement. Is really talking to people and maybe setting up governance boards where they get a say and can structure the way that the GBS and the shared services is set up. So I think from a measure perspective, Net Promoter Score is great. But if you really want to be successful, I think it's the engagement and the right advisory boards, governance boards, where they get a say in how shared services or GBS is structured and run to enable you to do better. And I think that's not done enough. A lot of the time there's a bit of a them and us rather than coming together collaboratively to say, how can we help each other? And you're as much to blame as we are. So I would certainly say the mixture of NPS as the measure and then putting in the right governance boards. No problem.
Rakesh.
Peter, I'm really worried by that smile you're giving me right now.
I have a HR question.
Sure.
So your last one, number 9, was all about skills, upskilling, reskilling. So one of the kind of things that's quite difficult at the moment, the difficult nut to crack, is integrated talent intelligence, where organizations are trying to move towards a more skill-based organization. So upskilling is definitely one of the things, but have you seen anything out there with regards to how organizations are moving towards not just being skill-based, but also skill-based rewards? So being rewarded based on what you have in your, the diplomas and on all the certifications you have and so on and so forth.
Increasingly, yes, but maybe not just by achieving the diploma. So, it's almost, I qualified as a chartered accountant. And when you become a chartered accountant, your salary doubles. Yeah, so that's a great example of what you're talking about, is you have the diploma and all of a sudden you're perceived as a lot more talented and a real asset within the industry. So we don't see as much of that in the GBS, but what we are starting to see is bonuses and incentives for hitting your outcome. The most popular one being in collections. So I would say the trend in collections today is to set up cash bonuses. So if your collectors are getting all of the cash in, then they're bonus to do that. So I think it's a real interesting debate, and I'm a big believer of it. I think people should be bonus for achieving above and beyond. Sometimes it's not as easy to do within the bureaucracy of our businesses and the way they're set up, but if you can do that, I think setting it up the right way is definitely the right thing to do, and linking it to the outcome. So not just to achieving a diploma, but what does that mean? How can you add more value for the business because you have that diploma? Thank you, Peter.
Hello. One question from my side as well. Monica from Nightrank. Hi, Rakesh. I have a question not about the services, not about the skills, but about the location. Some of our clients has on a short list Hungary, Romania, or Poland in terms of developing or opening newer GBS or shared service centers. If you will be so kind and tell us the one disadvantage and one advantage to be in Poland in compare of our neighbors, not India, not other, let's say.
First of all, the right answer is definitely Poland. But I think you're asking, how does Poland compare to Hungary and Romania specifically, advantages and disadvantage? I think disadvantage, I'll cover first. Romania is cheaper. Yeah? So yeah, that's an easy one. You move to, especially if you come outside of Bucharest and you move to Cluj or Timisoara, there's definitely cost benefit. I think the advantage of Poland, so I've been in this industry a long time, yeah? And so actually many of you won't remember, but Eastern Europe in our shared services outsourcing GBS industry really started with the Czech Republic. Yeah? So everyone used to move to Prague at the start. And then Prague got overly saturated, and they looked at Slovakia, and Poland came, a few years later. And the reason, and the reality is there's still plenty of businesses looking at Poland. And I think the reason for that is a few things. One is Poland is so big. So in the Czech Republic, you go to Prague, you go to Brno, and then the talent pool is difficult. Whereas in Poland, there's so many different cities that are opportunities to go into. So I think that's one thing. I think there's a real investment in upskilling that talent that I'm seeing in Poland as well. So Krakow, where we are today, is a great location, and it's been a hub for shared services for so long. Would I go out and say it should be the best location for transactional services? I'm not sure. But if I'm looking for a center of excellence, if I'm looking for people that have deep knowledge and expertise in these areas, and I'm looking for that specialist, proactive support that's going to give me a great work ethic, then I think it's a great location. And I have to say, we're a consulting firm, and we used to hire in the UK. Our strategy for the next 2 years is to predominantly do our hiring out of Poland, because we find a great talent pool with a good work ethic that really understands GBS, shared services, and outsourcing. So I think it's a great location for that. So the answer is Poland.
So I think we're pretty much done here. Well done, Rakesh. I think that was a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Riveting audience interaction as well.